Just 3 minutes ago, Prince Edward did the unthinkable. He publicly declared his daughter, Lady Louise Windsor, as the official Keeper of Windsor Traditions. But this wasn't just an honorific title. It was a sharp, deliberate snub to Queen Camilla, who had quietly positioned herself as the modern matriarch of the monarchy. The palace corridors are now echoing with whispers of betrayal, succession warfare, and a legacy that Edward may have just reshaped forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The announcement came not during a major ceremony, not from the king himself, but from a quietly staged speech delivered by Edward at Windsor's inner chapel, a place drenched in symbolism. At precisely noon, as bells rang in the distance, he named Lady Louise the living vessel of Windsor's heritage. For those well-versed in royal language, it was a statement louder than any proclamation from the throne. It wasn't just Edward's reverence for history on display, it was a power move. The timing was no accident. Just weeks before, Camilla had been reportedly positioning herself to lead a new royal initiative on tradition preservation. But this role, this title, it was now out of her reach, granted to a younger, quieter, and entirely unexpected heir. In the speech, Edward's phrasing was carefully measured but laced with unmistakable undertones. He spoke of those who seek to reshape legacy for comfort, a line many insiders took as a thinly veiled critique of Camilla's modernizing influence. And yet, Lady Louise stood at his side, her expression calm, her hands steady. The daughter, once sheltered from the spotlight, now thrust into a centuries-old narrative carrying the expectations of a fractured institution. The audience may have been limited in size, but the reverberations were instant. Every royal aide in attendance reportedly glanced to the empty chair reserved for Queen Camilla. She had declined to attend, citing other engagements. But no one believed that excuse. Camilla's absence was either a final act of defiance or an attempt to avoid being humiliated in real time. Royal sources suggest that she had been informed just hours before the ceremony, and not by Charles but by Edward himself. That breach of protocol alone sent shockwaves through royal ranks. For years, Edward had maintained a careful balance, loyal, reserved, never courting controversy. But in this moment, he chose sides. And his choice wasn't just about tradition, it was about blood, legacy, and whose version of Windsor would survive. The ripple effect reached across the palace. Aides were seen exchanging glances, whispering in corners, unsure of how to handle the unexpected narrative. One insider described the scene as eerily similar to the Queen's quiet appointments, decisive, unyielding, done with a smile that hides everything. This wasn't a slip. This was a recalibration of power. By bestowing the mantle of tradition on his daughter, Edward wasn't just looking to the past, he was protecting it from a future that, in his view, Camilla could not be trusted to preserve. Those closest to Edward claim he had been contemplating this move since the Queen's passing. That he saw in Lady Louise a glimmer of the steadfastness and restraint that defined Elizabeth's reign, and perhaps in naming her the Keeper of Windsor Traditions, Edward was also making amends for his own overlooked place in the royal hierarchy, ensuring that, at least in the realm of tradition, it would be his bloodline that held the keys. But if Edward's declaration shook the palace walls, what followed behind the scenes would tear at the foundation of royal unity itself. Sources close to Buckingham Palace confirm that Queen Camilla erupted in disbelief behind closed doors, not just because she was bypassed, but because the move threatened her symbolic authority as the Queen Consort. What happened inside Clarence House that night reportedly left staff rattled and Charles cornered by the fallout. The private corridors of Clarence House, typically muffled in tradition and quiet diplomacy, were shaken by a storm of words that had not echoed there since the darkest days of the monarchy's internal scandals. Camilla, blindsided by Edward's announcement, is said to have confronted Charles with a fury not seen since the early years of their union. According to royal insiders, the Queen Consort demanded to know how such a pivotal role had been handed to Lady Louise without her knowledge, and more importantly, without her consent. She didn't see it as a mere ceremonial oversight. She saw it as a message, a warning, a rejection of everything she had worked to rebuild in the Windsor image since Elizabeth's death. For years, Camilla had invested herself in reshaping the monarchy's rituals to reflect a modern sensibility, eliminating outdated traditions, softening protocols, and championing inclusivity. Her vision was progressive, but now all of it hung in the balance. The role of Keeper of Windsor Traditions was more than a title, it was a custodianship of legacy, narrative, and historical continuity. And in a single moment, Edward had handed that sacred trust not to the Queen Consort, but to his daughter, a young royal still finding her place. It was, in Camilla's view, a calculated strike. And in the tense stillness that followed her outburst, she used one word to describe what had been done to her: betrayal. Charles stood frozen, trapped between the storm of his wife's disappointment and the quiet conviction of his brother's intent. Those who witnessed the confrontation said he spoke little, offering only vague reassurances that the matter could be discussed in due course. But Camilla wasn't asking for time, she was demanding recognition. She had waited decades to be embraced by the institution that once vilified her. She had earned her crown through persistence, patience, and public tolerance. To be bypassed now, not by public will, but by a blood relative acting alone, reopened old wounds she believed had long since scarred over. The specter of Queen Elizabeth loomed over every word that night. Camilla, despite her title, had never truly been accepted by the Queen in the same way others had. There were gestures of civility, but never a formal passing of the traditional torch. Camilla had hoped time and duty would grant her that symbolic coronation in the eyes of the family. But Edward's move shattered that hope with chilling finality. And worse, some believed she had quietly prepared to assume the keeper role herself. Documents circulated, briefings drafted, plans made under the assumption that her influence was not just present, but permanent. Now, that carefully constructed influence was slipping through her fingers. Behind the public facade, Camilla's team began urgent strategy sessions to mitigate what was being described internally as an erosion of her institutional relevance. The question no longer centered on tradition, but power, and Camilla, once a quiet strategist, was suddenly cornered. As she scrambled to regain control, one quiet royal figure found herself thrust into a spotlight she never asked for but could no longer escape. She's been called the most overlooked royal, quiet, reserved, forgotten in the shadows of louder legacies. But Lady Louise Windsor has just become the most symbolically powerful young royal in Britain, and some say this has been Edward's plan all along. From the very beginning, Louise's life was marked by a curious absence from the public stage. No scandal, no spotlight, no staged appearances. While her cousins were paraded before cameras and their names splashed across headlines, Louise was raised behind thick palace walls and even thicker silences. At the time, it seemed like a choice made purely out of protection. But now, insiders are questioning whether it was part of something far more deliberate. A long game set in motion by Prince Edward, a father who had watched the institution bend and fracture under the weight of modernity and ambition. He didn't want his daughter in the circus. He wanted her untouched by it, and that may have been the very thing that saved her. Louise's bond with Prince Philip was especially unique. She shared his passion for carriage driving, but more than that, she carried his no-nonsense discipline and reverence for duty. Philip, who famously distrusted emotion and prized quiet strength, found a kindred spirit in Louise, someone who didn't crave attention, but command through presence. It was said that he took a special interest in her upbringing, even suggesting that Louise be kept far from royal pressures until she was old enough to understand what it meant to serve, not just to be seen. Then there was her relationship with Queen Elizabeth, a connection that, while less publicized, was equally profound. The Queen often invited Louise for private teas at Windsor, long after the others had returned to their respective roles. Those close to the late monarch whispered that she saw something in Louise that reminded her of herself: a stillness, a clarity, an incorruptible air. All of this came full circle the moment Edward named her Keeper of Windsor Traditions. That title, rarely used in the modern monarchy, holds more than ceremonial significance. It is a charge to preserve the rituals, oaths, and quiet codes that define the heart of Windsor, even when the crown itself evolves. By bestowing it on Louise, Edward wasn't just honoring his daughter. He was anchoring the monarchy in its past, and to some he was isolating it from a future shaped by Camilla. Insiders now see. All Louise, the last uncorrupted Windsor. She has no Instagram following, no clothing line, no lucrative deals cloaked in charity. She does not smile on demand nor perform on cue. And in a family that has been deeply bruised by fame, that restraint has become her power. Those who serve closest to the crown have noticed a shift in tone and almost reverent hush when Louise enters a room. And yet, for all the strength others now assign to her, Louise herself is said to be wrestling with the enormity of it. She never asked for this role. She was never groomed to lead a cultural revival. Her life was meant to be quieter, simpler, tucked behind the grandeur. But the moment she accepted the mantle from her father, that life ended. Princess Anne, who has long carried the burden of being the monarchy's quiet workhorse, has reportedly taken Louise under her wing. The two are often seen in private conversation at royal events, and aides suggest Anne has become something of a mentor, offering guidance, yes, but also warning, because Anne knows what it means to carry the weight of duty without the shield of popularity. She knows that being underestimated is both armor and curse. Now, Louise must navigate an identity that was crafted without her input, but demands her full commitment. She stands at the crossroads between sacred legacy and personal longing. And as the world begins to recognize her as something more than a quiet footnote in royal history, the question becomes, will she fully step into the role that fate and her father have carved out for her? But while the public began to embrace Louise's quiet rise, Camilla was already moving to reclaim what she believed was hers through forceful influence and political maneuvering. She's no stranger to palace power games. Queen Camilla, seasoned in the art of survival, has begun a counter-offensive, but this time, it's not just about optics. It's about legacy. Camilla is determined to ensure the traditions of Windsor do not bypass her entirely, and she's enlisted powerful allies to make it happen. The moment the announcement regarding Lady Louise was made public, Camilla retreated, but not in surrender. In strategy. Those closest to her say the Queen Consort activated a discreet network of influence, reaching out to seasoned courtiers, long-trusted advisors, and even sympathetic members of Parliament. These were not casual chats, they were calculated maneuvers, intended to remind the establishment that tradition, in the hands of a teenage royal, could easily be reframed as ceremonial fluff. Behind the velvet curtains of royal formality, the true war had begun not for the crown, but for control of the narrative. Among the whispers now echoing through the palace halls is talk of a Royal Tradition Council, a body reportedly proposed by Camilla herself, meant to oversee the preservation and modernization of royal customs. Some believe it's a clever way to reinsert herself into the very role Edward handed to his daughter. Others view it as a direct challenge, a shadow institution created to compete with the symbolic power of Lady Louise. It's said Camilla already has backers, individuals with long memories and vested interests in ensuring that no single bloodline dictates the course of Windsor's future. Meanwhile, subtle attacks began to appear across favored press outlets. Carefully worded pieces questioned the legitimacy of Edward's choice, noting that the role of keeper held no constitutional weight and should not be mistaken for influence. One columnist even suggested the appointment was a charming gesture from a nostalgic father, effectively reducing Louise's elevation to a sentimental family moment, nothing more. Camilla's team, according to insiders, was instrumental in shaping that narrative. The goal wasn't to discredit Louise entirely, it was to blur the lines, to sow doubt about what the title truly meant. And while these efforts intensified, King Charles remained maddeningly silent. Repeatedly urged by both sides to clarify the crown's position, he refused. His inaction has become a source of deep frustration, particularly for Camilla, who sees it as both betrayal and weakness. Charles's neutrality, however, may not be as passive as it seems. Some believe he is intentionally letting the storm play out, unwilling to antagonize his brother or his wife further, but in doing so, he risks becoming the monarch who stood idle while the house divided itself again. But Camilla, undeterred, is reportedly preparing a public initiative that could change everything. A sweeping project meant to spotlight her contributions to the preservation of royal history, an effort many now see as a preemptive strike. If she can prove that she, not Lady Louise, is the true guardian of Windsor's past, she may yet reclaim the space she believes is rightfully hers. And so, staff across the palaces are being forced to pick quiet allegiances. There are no open declarations, just a deepening chill in the air, side glances, whispers, loyalties tested not by blood but by ideology. The Alice is no longer just a home, it's a battlefield of legacy. And Camilla, once the outsider clawing for legitimacy, is now the strategist laying claim to a version of history that includes her at its center. But not everyone inside the House of Windsor agrees. And just as Camilla began rewriting the narrative, a hidden family document emerged, one that would turn speculation into seismic scandal. Hidden deep within Windsor's archives was a letter no one expected to resurface, handwritten by Queen Elizabeth II herself, and never meant for the public. But once its contents were revealed, everything changed. Edward's decision, Lady Louise's role, Camilla's fury, it all made sense. Because the Queen had already chosen her successor in tradition, It began with a quiet search, one not authorized by the crown but initiated by a trusted aide loyal to the late monarch. He had been tasked with cataloging private correspondence left in sealed envelopes within a restricted wing of the archive, an area known only to a handful within the institution. As he worked through decades of handwritten notes, diplomatic exchanges, and personal messages, he found a slim envelope marked in the Queen's unmistakable cursive, "For the eyes of my house, not the world." Inside, on crisp, pale parchment, was a letter that carried not just her words but her will. The Queen had spoken beyond the grave, and her message was clear. Lady Louise was to be the keeper of the traditions that shaped the crown, the vessel through which its essence would quietly endure. The words were stunning in their clarity. "Louise has the strength to hold what must never be spoken," the Queen wrote. "She is unshaped by ambit, ion, unclouded by spectacle. She is the vessel of Windsor's legacy." Nowhere in the letter was Camilla named outright, but the Queen's meaning was impossible to ignore. There were lines that drew a line between those who wore the crown and those who carried its meaning. She made a distinction between public duty and spiritual stewardship. "A consort may represent," she wrote, "but a custodian must remember." That subtle phrasing, read now in the shadow of Edward's decision, felt like a dagger wrapped in silk. When Edward read the letter privately for the first time, those close to him say his hands trembled. It wasn't just validation, it was a charge, a confirmation that what he had done for Louise was not an act of defiance, but an act of fulfillment. The Queen had known. The Queen had planned. But that letter had never been shared until now, and even then it wasn't meant to go further. Edward had tried to keep it within a small circle of trusted family, but royal truths have a way of leaking, especially when they contradict the ambitions of those still breathing. There were efforts to suppress it. Aides debated shredding it entirely. Others proposed sealing it once more in the archives, hidden under the guise of security protocol. But word spread. The existence of the letter was whispered from one wing of the palace to the next, and soon a copy had found its way into the possession of someone close to Camilla. Her response was immediate. She viewed the letter as an affront, a final blow from a monarch who never fully embraced her. The fact that Charles had known of its existence and chosen to remain silent only deepened the wound. To Camilla, it was not a private affliction, it was a judgment, and it carried more weight in death than it ever would have in life. As for Charles, those near him insist he kept the letter buried not out of spite but preservation. He had inherited a fragile crown. To reveal the Queen's true intentions, especially ones that undermined his own consort, could have shattered the tenuous peace he'd worked so hard to build. But now the letter had escaped its intended silence. Now it was a weapon, and its fallout was only beginning. Because not everyone accepted the Queen's final wishes, and a secret meeting would bring the tension to a boiling point. It was never supposed to leak. A royal summit called in haste, under the guise of family unity. But what really unfolded at Balmoral was a verbal showdown between Edward and Camilla, one that left the royal household divided and the public gasping once details emerged. The invitation list alone spoke volumes. Some names were expected, others conspicuously absent. A few senior royals declined without explanation, their silence louder than any statement. Those who did attend arrived wary, already aware that this was no routine gathering. The atmosphere was brittle, strained by weeks of unspoken tension following Edward's announcement and the resurfacing of the Queen's letter. This was meant to be containment. Instead, it became combustion. Camilla wasted little time. According to multiple accounts, she confronted Edward directly, her restraint finally gone. She accused him of humiliating her, of sidelining her authority in favor of sentiment and bloodline. And then came the words that froze the room. "You've made a mockery of tradition." Edward did not retreat. He didn't soften his tone or hide behind protocol. He stood firm, reminding everyone present that tradition was not a costume to be worn for convenience, nor a tool for reinvention. His reply cut through the tension with surgical precision. "I'm preserving it. You're rewriting it." It was the clearest line drawn yet between guardianship and ambition, between inheritance and entitlement. For a moment, no one spoke. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a reckoning. Charles said nothing. His silence unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have. Some interpreted it as tacit agreement with Edward, others as a king paralyzed by an impossible choice. To Camilla, it felt like abandonment. To Edward, it was confirmation that the line he'd crossed would not be erased. And then, unexpectedly, Princess Anne spoke. Known for her blunt honesty and unwavering sense of duty, she voiced support for Edward's decision and for Louise's role. She framed it not as rebellion, but as continuity and echo of the Queen's values carried forward, without compromise. Her words shifted the balance, signaling that Edward was not alone. The meeting dissolved without resolution. No statements were drafted, no unity restored. Instead, there was a growing, unmistakable realization settling over everyone present. The family was fracturing again. Not through scandal or exile, but through ideology. Through a disagreement about what the monarchy was meant to be, and who had the right to define it. Old wounds reopened. New alliances formed quietly. And the Queen's shadow loomed over it all, her final wishes now a foul LT line running through the heart of Windsor. The secrecy didn't last. It never does. Whispers escaped Balmoral and raced ahead of the royals themselves, shaping narratives before anyone could stop them. Because the consequences weren't just personal, they were public. And the ripple effect soon reached Parliament, tabloids, and global headlines. By the following morning, every major newspaper carried the story. Lady Louise crowned Keeper of Windsor Tradition. But buried beneath the headlines was a brewing media war, and Camilla wasn't going down without a fight. As the nation weighed in, royal approval ratings shifted, and the future of the monarchy itself came under fire. The press wasted no time. Headlines turned bold declarations into battlefield banners. Edward SNUBS Camilla, tradition reborn through Louise. The public was gripped. For some, it was a heartening return to lineage and loyalty. For others, it was an act of internal rebellion, a rupture in the image of a monarchy striving to present unity. As the story gained momentum, Camilla's media machine roared to life. Editorials, op-eds, strategic interviews, each designed to reframe the narrative. In them, Camilla was cast not as a sidelined consort, but as the people's custodian, modern, relatable, compassionate. Her allies in the press portrayed Lady Louise's role as ceremonial fluff, a relic designed to appeal to aging monarchists nostalgic for the past. The clash ignited public opinion like a match to dry brush. Social media platforms became digital arenas of loyalty and dissent. Hashtags supporting Louise trended within hours, particularly among younger generations who saw in her a figure untainted by politics, scandal, or ambition. They called her the quiet royal with real roots. Yet others were quick to defend Camilla, arguing she had earned her place through resilience and reinvention, and deserved the authority that came with it. The divide wasn't just generational, it was philosophical. Were traditions sacred, or should they evolve to reflect the nation they claimed to serve? Even Parliament couldn't ignore the uproar. While the monarchy is technically above the legislative fray, debates began to surface in hushed tones. Questions were raised about whether symbolic roles like the one Lady Louise had assumed should be left to private heritage foundations, rather than endorsed by senior royals. Some MPs argued this public power play blurred lines between duty and favoritism, while others welcomed a fresh face to an ancient institution. Every word spoken within those chambers only heightened public scrutiny, feeding the fire rather than extinguishing it. Caught in the storm, Buckingham Palace issued a statement so deliberately vague, it did more to confirm tension than to quell it. His Majesty is proud of all members of the royal family and their commitment to heritage and service, it read. No mention of Edward, no recognition of Louise's role, no defense of Camilla. The neutrality felt unnatural, and to many it signaled that the rift inside the royal household was no longer speculation, it was fact. The monarchy wasn't just facing a moment of bad press, it was facing a crisis of identity. And yet, while the world debated who should carry the torch of tradition, the one person at the center of it all had remained silent. No interviews, no rebuttals, no performance. But amid the noise, Lady Louise herself was preparing for a moment that would redefine her and silence her doubters once and for all. She had remained silent while the world spoke for her, but now, with the monarchy's traditions and future resting on her shoulders, Lady Louise Windsor made the rarest of moves. She stepped forward, and with a single speech, she shattered royal expectations and delivered a message that left even Camilla speechless. It was never billed as a major event, no formal broadcast, no statement from Buckingham Palace. And yet, the gathering at St. George's Chapel that morning carried a weight impossible to ignore. Attendees arrived expecting a simple service of remembrance in honor of Queen Elizabeth's legacy. But what unfolded was something far more symbolic, far more seismic. Lady Louise, positioned quietly at the edge of the pews, rose not when called by rank but by purpose. She moved to the lectern with composure beyond her years and began to speak, not with grandeur, but with grace. Her voice was calm, her cadence deliberate, and yet every word she uttered resounded with generations of meaning. In the span of 4 minutes, Louise reframed the entire conversation. She did not speak of power, nor of heritage as entitlement. Instead, she spoke of service, of silence, of continuity. Tradition, she said, is not owned, it's carried. It lives not in titles or ceremonies, but in the quiet choices we make to protect what we may never fully understand. In those few lines, she dismantled the notion that royal roles could be claimed by ambition or reshaped by opinion. And she did it without naming Camilla, without referencing the controversy that had engulfed the House of Windsor. But her meaning was unmistakable. The silence that followed her speech was thunderous. Then, slowly, members of the royal family began to rise, not all, but enough. A standing ovation from those who had once questioned her place, who now saw her not just as Edward's daughter, but as something far more symbolic, a bridge between the past they revered and the future they feared. Camilla remained seated, her face unmoved, her hands clenched. To some it looked like defiance, to others disbelief, but to Louise it didn't matter. The speech had never been about winning approval, it had been about clarity. Social media, already ignited by the weeks of tension, exploded within moments. #Keeper Louise trended across continents. Clips of her speech circulated faster than the palace could respond. Young voices called her the monarchy's quiet compass, while pundits admitted that no spin doctor could have written what she'd delivered. It wasn't branding, it wasn't strategy, it was authenticity. In an institution drowning in spectacle, that alone felt revolutionary. Edward stood at the back, away from the cameras, but his pride was unmistakable. Those who caught a glimpse described his expression as both relieved and overcome. For him, this moment was more than validation, it was culmination. The plan he had carried in silence, the hope he had placed in his daughter, had bloomed on that altar not in defiance of the monarchy, but in defense of what made it endure. But even as Louise cemented her role in royal history, one final twist emerged, hinting that Camilla wasn't finished yet. In the twilight of the Queen's legacy, Prince Edward's bow move has redrawn the royal map, and Queen Camilla's exclusion may be only the beginning. With Lady Louise now at the heart of Windsor tradition, the battle for influence within the monarchy is far from over. And as tensions rise, insiders warn another storm is coming. Camilla has retreated, but not in defeat, rather, in calculated silence. There are no public appearances, no formal statements, no rebuttals to Louise's rising popularity. But within palace corridors, whispers swirl of a final countermove, something being quietly drafted behind closed doors. Her team, though publicly dormant, has not been dismantled. They are watching, waiting, studying every shift in public sentiment, every comment from within the family, every ripple of disruption in the press. Because Camilla knows the monarchy rarely moves in haste, but when it does, it moves with ruthless precision. She won't be erased easily. That much is certain. Royal historians, too, have entered the fray. In articles and symposiums, debates rage over what this moment truly represents. Some argue Edward's elevation of Louise is a return to pre-Camilla values, an era where tradition wasn't branded or broadcast, but lived. Others view it as a generational pivot, a reassertion of bloodline over adaptation. For many, it's the first visible fracture of King Charles's reign. He was meant to unify, to steady the ship in the wake of Elizabeth's passing. But what now lies ahead is not unity, it is redefinition. And not all will survive the shift. Charles, ever the careful mediator, finds himself isolated in a house now split along invisible lines. Sources close to the king describe a man worn down, struggling to reconcile personal loyalty with public expectation. He watches his brother's popularity grow in real time, fueled not by flash or spectacle, but by a quiet sense of moral clarity. For the first time, people are whispering what would have once been unthinkable, that Edward, not Charles, may be the true moral heir to the Queen's vision, the one who understood not just the performance of tradition, but its sacredness, the one who saw legacy not as a burden, but as a blueprint. And the next generation is watching. George and Charlotte, still young but keenly observant, are absorbing the undertones of this royal storm. Behind their smiles and polished appearances lies the reality that the monarchy they will inherit is being rewritten before their eyes. Whether they step into a legacy forged by Camilla's modern monarchy, or one resurrected through Louise's lineage, will define how the crown survives the coming decades. Their futures are being shaped not in ceremonies, but in conflicts like these. This moment is not a final chapter, it's an awakening. The Queen's passing did not close the book on Windsor tradition, it opened it to scrutiny. Edward's actions have set in motion a new narrative, one rooted in memory, sacrifice, and silent strength. Camilla's exclusion, once seen as personal, now echoes as symbolic, and in that silence, a new power is forming. The final line of Queen Elizabeth's sealed letter, now circulating behind palace walls, reads with haunting clarity, "This is not the end of tradition. It's only the beginning of its reckoning." The palace gates may appear quiet, but behind them a battle for the soul of the monarchy is far from over. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.